So a while back I made a video saying I was worried about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. In it, I expressed concern about how the game is going from a more linear, story-based game to an open-world game, and what that may or may not mean for the franchise as a whole, and what it might mean for the game. I was worried that the inclusion of all of this open-world stuff would dilute the game's experience in a way that just didn't really make it feel like the Zelda game and the Zelda formula that I've come to know and love over the past few decades now. But hey, now that the game is finally out and I've had a good week to play it and a good weekend to basically do nothing but play Zelda, I figured, hey, why not talk about it? I'm going to treat this as a sort of informal review, not like a fully deep dive analytical review, but more about how I feel about the game in general, how it's made me feel, and whether or not my worries from that previous video are realized or justified or whatever you want to say about it. I will try to keep this video as spoiler-free as I possibly can, but there will be some very minor spoilers about what exists in the world and then what I feel about the story overall, at least that which I have experienced of it. It's going to be a very high-level discussion here. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, so if even minor spoilers are going to be a problem for you, I urge you to click off of this video right now. And now that all of those people are gone, let's begin. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a game that doesn't really pull any punches. It kind of reminds me of the way Nintendo used to be back in the day, back before they got all hand-holdy and afraid to take risks with their franchises. It kind of harkens back to the day of difficult video games and experimentation and innovation that Nintendo and their games and their franchises were known for. It's easy to look back on the past few years and just see how stagnant Nintendo's franchises have become. That's not to say that Nintendo's franchises are anywhere close to failing, except for maybe Star Fox and Metroid. Someday we'll get those back. But you can definitely see that Nintendo has fallen into a pattern of safety when it comes to Mario and Zelda and their big moneymakers. For example, Mario's almost a joke right now, basically the poster child of anything Nintendo. They're not afraid to throw him in anything these days for a quick buck. You can see Super Mario Run. While that's a pretty cool game, it's just, it strips away the gameplay for more tappy tap. It's a cool experience, but should Mario be in it? I don't think so. But this isn't a Mario Run video, so let's get back to Zelda. Anyway, this game kind of throws you straight into the thick of it, with a tutorial that spans a relatively large area. And I say tutorial with a bit of a grain of salt, because while for all intents and purposes, the Great Plateau, the area that you start on, is a tutorial, it's still a fully fleshed out area in its own right. This is the area that's going to teach you how to play the game. It's going to teach you the controls. It's going to get you used to the world, and it's going to get you used to dying, because that's going to be something you're going to do a lot in this game. I mentioned that this game is going back to Nintendo's roots in terms of difficulty, and that is absolutely true. This game is not afraid to murder you over and over and over again. And that by itself is a huge breath of fresh air that I absolutely appreciate. I'm so sick of not being mechanically engaged in the games that I'm playing because the developers are too scared to exclude people who may not have the mechanical dexterity required to beat some of these more physically challenging games. I'd love to elaborate on that more, but I feel like I can make a whole video on that topic about the difference between difficulty and inclusion when it comes to gaming. But I don't really want to dive too deep into that. All I want to say about that is that I really appreciate the mechanical difficulty of this game. It gives you the ability to build up your strength by going out and doing things that will get you more hearts, which in turn makes you stronger, which in turn lets you fight bigger and stronger things, which in turn gets you better weapons, which in turn helps you get stronger and explore more places. I feel like the difficulty of the game and the loop that revolves around it is very, very satisfying. You start in the world with nothing, you eventually find some weapons, you find some shrines, you solve some puzzles, then you get more hearts, which lets you get more weapons, which lets you find more shrines, which lets you get more hearts, which lets you find more weapons and then find more shrines. It's a never-ending cycle until I guess you run out of shrines, but that's going to take a hell of a long time because this world is massive. It's absolutely huge. I remember first booting up the game and then jumping into the world, going out into the Great Plateau and just running around and doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing, exploring and going through the little tutorial quests that it sends you on. And I remember feeling like the Great Plateau, this area that I was on, was huge. I remember feeling that it was really, really large. It's like, this is hard to get around. I have to run everywhere. This is taking forever. And then when you finally get off of that Great Plateau, you realize just how massive the world is. You realize just how small that little plateau actually was. You're faced with this huge world in front of you and nothing to do but go. Open world games in general have gotten a bit of a bad rap lately. And for good reason. Ubisoft seems to put out like 16 of them every single year. And then the video game industry in general has just been making more and more of them ever since the Elder Scrolls franchise got more and more popular. And there's a good reason why. I mean, big open world games represent a lot of content for a lot of people. If it's in a game that you enjoy with gameplay that you find engaging and a world that you find interesting, you can get a lot out of a pretty good open world game. There's always a reason to come back, and especially if it's moddable, there's definitely always a reason to come back. I have friends who have played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of Fallout and Elder Scrolls and stuff like that. It's so easy to get lost in these huge worlds if you're enjoying the game. And while I do enjoy open world games now and again, for me, it's always felt a bit aimless, you know? I've never minded a linear story-based game. I've always really, really liked the normal Legend of Zelda formula because it guided you. It told you where to go, and it let you experience the story at the pace that it was meant to be experienced. And this isn't just Zelda games. It's like any game with a linear storyline. As long as it's well-paced, it's incredible. The Last of Us is one of my favorite games ever because the story was so good. If The Last of Us was an open world game, the story would not have had nearly as big of an impact on me as it did. And it's not just about the story. It's about being guided to the things that I can do and that I want to do and that will benefit me as a player. Maybe in general, open world games aren't for me, but I find myself aimless in these settings because I never know where I want to go. Do I want to go to this random town? Maybe I want to go visit this cave somewhere. You're wandering around the world and maybe you find that cave. Maybe you find this weird tower. Maybe you find some town. And based on what you find there, you do something elsewhere. But the thing is, you're never really guaranteed to have a good experience in that town or in that cave. Like maybe you go into that cave, you fight a few things, and then you come out worse than you entered with. You found garbage in there, you found nothing worth selling, and you used a few potions, and now you're at a net negative for having dug into that cave. I felt like that was an experience that happened far too often. There was nothing really meaningful to make you want to actually explore many of these places, and that's why I felt so fatigued by many of these things. And then there's the whole Ubisoft formula where you just climb a tower and you survey the area, and then you have all these things on your minimap that you just need to go do. You need to go rescue this guy, you need to go visit this cave, you need to go find this collectible, and you need to do this thing. It's exhausting, you know? But in Breath of the Wild, I don't really feel like I've run into that aimlessness. And I think there's two reasons for that. First, when you go up to a tower, the only thing that unlocks is the ability to see the topography of the area that you found the tower in. So you can see the elevation, you can see some trees, some lakes, maybe where there's paths, and maybe where there's some buildings. And that's it. There's nothing marked on the map until you visit that place. Just because you can see the topography and the layout of the map does not mean that you immediately know where everything is. So that keeps the feeling of exploration and discovery as you continue to explore that area, because you're going to be in that area for a while because these areas are massive. All those towers ever really did was rob you of the discovery. And while it is important to climb these towers in Breath of the Wild, it never robs you of that discovery, and it feels good to continue exploring that area because you never know what you're going to come across. And these towers lead very well into my second point, because these towers give you a nice vantage point, at least most of the time, with which to look down on the landscape and survey it, and look around for any of the shrines that happen to be in the area. They have this nice orange glow if you haven't solved them yet, so you can see them from a pretty good distance, whether it's day or night. And then you can easily mark them with your little zoom in capability. And then on your mini map, you just have like a little pin that you can follow. And that's the direction you're heading, and whatever you find on the way, you're going to discover that too. But it's these shrines. It's these shrines that are the reason that I don't have this aimless feeling of, now what do I do? I don't know if this is going to be worth my time, because the shrines are always worth it. Now here's one of those minor spoilers. Every time you complete a shrine, you get a spirit orb, and 4 of those spirit orbs allow you to trade those in for either a heart container or a stamina increase, both of which are very important. So you know if you're going to go into that shrine and you're going to complete that shrine, you're going to have something that will absolutely definitively go towards powering up Link. It's a very minor detail, but it makes exploration and discovery feel pretty good for the most part. You know if you have that shrine, it's going to be worth it. And it's not just because of those spirit orbs that it feels rewarding. Each of these shrines comes with its own little puzzle that you have to solve, and each one is different, and each one is interesting and engaging in its own way. And that means a lot. That means a lot more than I actually ever expected it to mean, because I mean, as I'm talking about this right now, I just want to go back into the game and play some more, even though I spent 30 hours this weekend just playing and playing and playing when I should have been working on these videos for you guys. But it's because this game doesn't rob you of the sense of discovery, and because the discovery actually leads to you actually powering up your character in the end, it feels really solid. It feels really good. The loop feels great. Now, you might have caught that I said for the most part, and here's where I'm going to air a few of my grievances. Another part of the gameplay loop that I haven't mentioned yet is the weapon durability system. Now, this system has been a pretty big point of contention for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. And of course, I have my own take on it. I think that the weapon durability system that is in Breath of the Wild has gone a little bit overboard. Now, you can take that as me saying that I stand somewhere in between of absolutely loving that it forces you into some variety, and then on the other side, absolutely hating it. I sit somewhere in between those. And here's why. I do enjoy that the weapon durability system does force some variety in a way. I do think it makes sense for these weapons to break down over time. However, these weapons are so unbelievably fragile and break so unbelievably quickly that you can easily tear through 2 or 3 of them in any fight. The durability is so low that you just find yourself actively avoiding fights a lot of the time. Because chances are you're going to lose 1 or 2 of your good weapons just through using them, and you're probably not going to be able to replace it in that fight. You'll probably be able to replace it with something weaker or something that you don't really enjoy as much, but those other weapons, they're gone. So while I do like that it forces you to think, it forces you to manage some resources in a new way, in a way that's new to the Legend of Zelda series, I feel like it could be a little more lenient. I would like to be able to keep my weapon for a little longer, you know? I would like to be able to kill more than 2 enemies with my broadsword, for example. It's a little ridiculous. It's a little excessive. And with as unbelievably fragile as these things are, I think that it detracts from the experience. I don't mind that my weapons break, I mind the speed in which they are breaking. And here's a point that's somewhat related, but somewhat not related. Part of the reason you avoid fights is because your only real reward for getting into these fights is a treasure chest, but most of the time these treasure chests are filled with something that isn't good. Most of the time, it's going to be a weapon that's probably weaker than the ones that the enemies you just fought dropped themselves, Or maybe it's some gemstone that after like 40 hours of gameplay, I still don't really understand the significance of. There's opals, luminous stones, diamonds, amber, ruby, etc. You can even gather wood, which you can't really find in these chests. But the point is, there's so many things that you can get out of these treasure chests that's not actually worth your time, that you even end up wanting to skip treasure chests because there's nothing really in it for you. And while I mentioned earlier that the sense of progression from the shrines is kind of what keeps you pushing forward and pushes the game forward along with it, this system that basically penalizes you for getting into fights by giving you rewards that aren't really worth your time, that maybe you can trade in to somebody for some paltry amount of rupees that you probably won't even find a way to spend anyway, is a bit of a step back. Granted, the later in the game you get, the more durable a lot of these weapons become, but it's still a problem throughout the entirety of the game, and it detracts from the experience. And it never feels good to resent going out of your way for that treasure chest. And speaking of excess, the stamina meter is also excessively crappy. Again, I'm standing kind of in between the love it and hate it spectrum with this. I don't have a problem with the stamina meter as a whole, and I at least do appreciate the fact that you can fight without stamina. Like, you can still swing your weapon without stamina, and you're perfectly okay. But man, Link gets winded so easily. Sprinting takes so much stamina. You're out of stamina in just a few seconds of sprinting. And in a world as large as this, it sucks, man. I want to be able to run around in places. I want to be able to get places quickly. I want to be able to get where I'm going. But when Link sprints for like 20 yards and he's like, hold on, guys. Okay, I'm good again. And then he sprints 20 more yards and he's like, oh man, that was a real freaking cough. Sorry, I'm getting over a head cold, so that got a little more real than I was expecting. But you get what I'm saying, right? He gets it winded way too easily. It's excessive again. They could have given him more sprinting time, and that wouldn't have taken anything away from the game. There's nothing it would have taken away from the game, at least in what I've experienced so far. The climbing with the stamina, I think, is pretty fair. Although, it's hard for me to gauge whether or not I should just jump my way up, or if I should just do that very slow crawl up the side of the cliff. But it's a very interesting resource management thing, again, like the weapons. So overall, I don't really have any problem with it. The story overall is about what you would expect from a Zelda game. There is some voice acting, which I enjoy. It lets me connect to the characters a little better. It lets me appreciate the emotions that they're going through much better than if it was a normal Zelda game with nothing but text. I'm really liking it. I'm not all the way through the story yet, but what I've experienced of it, I think it's pretty cool. And you know, open world games generally have this weird issue of you have to save the world, and it's urgent, but hey, wait, I want to go do this other thing first. So if the world can wait, I really want to go tame a horse right now. So just put the fires out yourselves for now. I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna catch that horse. So you'll be fine, right? I'm gonna be right over there. A lot of open world games have that problem, but I feel like Breath of the Wild has effectively written around it. While the world does depend on Link to save it, the world also doesn't even care that he exists in this world. Link's just another inhabitant running around doing things. The world's not there for him. The world's just there and he's in it. And I think it was pretty clever how they wrote around that typical trope of, I'm gonna go tame a horse, the world could save itself. So I do appreciate that they at least wrote around that weird dichotomy of urgency and side questing in a way that feels very natural and not forced. So, as for some closing thoughts, I really like this game. I'm way more into it than I thought I would be. But, and here's where I'm going to get a lot of people angry probably, I don't think it's a very good Zelda game. This is a very good game, but I don't think it's a very good Zelda game. I mentioned earlier that I've never really had any problem with the linear way Zelda has been telling its story for the past couple decades now. And I keep hearing arguments that harken back to Zelda 1 and how you're just plopped into the world with no knowledge of anything and you're just expected to go. There are a lot of similarities, but look, we're separated by over 30 years of technology and game design evolution. There's probably a reason why all of the Zelda games after the first went more and more towards linearity. Sure, the later ones, especially Skyward Sword, which is probably one of my least favorites, even though I still really enjoyed it, became way too linear, but I feel like Breath of the Wild is overcompensating a little bit. You can compare it to Zelda 1 all you want, but the series evolved for a reason. And while I don't want to say you're not allowed to experiment with the formula of a franchise, I also feel like what Breath of the Wild is betrays a lot of the tropes that we've come to appreciate the most from the Zelda franchise as a whole. Now, there's a lot of people who criticize Nintendo and Nintendo franchises for being stagnant and boring and predictable lately, and admittedly, I made a very similar argument at the top of this video, but when it comes to Zelda, I was happy with the formula that it had. With the exception of Skyward Sword, of course, because it took away that pseudo-open world that Zelda was known for in lieu of a very, very, very overly linear experience. Zelda's always been linear, but it's always had that sort of pseudo-open world feeling, which made it almost feel like a hybrid between a linear game and an open world game at times. But there are a lot of things that an open world can't really do quite as well as a linear experience. And one of those things is storytelling. Even if the main quest is very linear, you're still going to be experiencing the story of the world at your own pace. The lore of the world, like how every settlement or every area has been affected by what's been going on in the game's universe. In a more linear experience, you're going to get that as it's fed to you. It'll be paced better. It'll make more sense. In an open world, a lot of that is left up to the imagination and your own exploration. You can directly see the effects of everything that has been happening while you weren't there. And I don't want to say that one is better than the other. They both have their merits, but the open world style is just not what I've come to expect from Zelda. Additionally, stuff becomes harder to gate. And what I mean by that is, if you can imagine A Link to the Past, in the Dark World, there's this bridge that kind of cuts off the north side of the map and the bottom half of the map. And on that bridge, there are some little pegs that you have to hit with a hammer if you want to get through. That's how A Link to the Past gated off its world, with items that you get, certain specific items. And because Breath of the Wild is open world, it'd be really hard for the developer to hide items in a way that's organic, in a way that doesn't feel contrived, you know? It's like, oh, why did I find a hammer here? Or, hey, it doesn't matter which shrine I visit first, I always find a hammer in that one. It would be impossible for them to gate things behind items that you're required to have without making it too hard to find. In a world this big, how would you even be able to do that? Sure, you could tie it to the main story quests, but then you betray the whole open world feeling by making it feel like you have to go do those story quests before you can actually continue to explore the world. So you have to choose which place to make sacrifices. And while there is some ability growth throughout the game, and I'm not going to spoil what it is, outside of very few instances have I really felt that they allow me to get to a place where I wouldn't have been able to get to otherwise. And because of that, I feel like it makes it hard on the developers to design another main Zelda trope that I'm really, really missing from this game, and that's full-sized dungeons or temples or whatever you want to call them. Now, Breath of the Wild has a couple of areas, and again, I'm not going to be any more specific than saying a couple of areas, that are sort of very short mini dungeons, occasionally with a boss at the end, and occasionally there are some bosses, some minor bosses strewn across the landscape across Hyrule that will offer some sort of a challenge. But these small, really short dungeons are just that. They're really short. I'd say they're even shorter than the well in Ocarina of Time. You know, you jump down there, you get the Lens of Truth, you come back out. They're maybe that long, maybe shorter. And that's probably the most disappointing thing for me so far. It's that I miss the dungeons. I miss going into this huge monolithic structure and having this awesome labyrinth to explore, keys to find, power-ups to gain, and threats to vanquish. Sure, maybe a lot of that can harken back to the whole linear versus non-linear argument, because if you have most of your powers from the very beginning, how are you going to make the dungeon difficult? I personally don't know, but I think Nintendo could come up with something interesting. At least they did for A Link Between Worlds. You could basically tackle any dungeon in any order, and you could have all the items in pretty much most of those dungeons. So they could have done something. They could have put some dungeons in this game. I feel like that would have placated at least me. At the end of the day, my big problem with open world games and the open world formula in general is that progress as a whole feels very much stifled compared to a more linear experience. And yes, that directly contrasts what I said earlier about how going into these shrines gets you direct progress, but it's a very minor amount of progress. You know, going into a dungeon in any other Zelda game means that you're taking a pretty big step in that game's adventure. You go into a shrine in this game, it's a very small step. Sure, there's a few things around the world that you can directly go to in Breath of the Wild to progress the story, and if you wanted to, you could do that pretty quickly. But as a whole, Breath of the Wild suffers from making progress feel very, 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 very slow. And this is a general problem that open world games face, and it makes Zelda Breath of the Wild feel much slower than its predecessors. Going back to a point that I said at the beginning of the video, this could be a good thing depending on who you are, because an open world game, because it's slow, it means that you can get a lot more time out of the game than you probably would a more linear experience. And that in itself is great. Just like I said, it's not what I personally wanted or expected from a Zelda game. But that's just me. Anyway, I said closing thoughts and I've been talking for quite a while. So yeah, real closing thoughts. I think Breath of the Wild is a wonderful game. I think it's a really good game. I think it's really fun, and I think it's a breath of fresh air for the whole open world genre. It feels great, it looks good, but it's held down by a very clunky weapon durability system, an overzealous stamina system, and horrible, horrible performance issues, which I'm only realizing that I completely neglected to mention until now. Like, seriously, in some places in the game, it feels like it drops down to about 10 frames per second. I'm playing on the Switch and it's running at like 900p at 30 frames per second, and it can't even maintain a steady frame rate with that. Come on, we could be doing better than that right now. It's very rare for the performance issues to get in the way of my actual gameplay, but I would really love a very steady 60 frames per second. It would just make the game look that much better. And I'm disappointed that the Switch is not able to put out 1080p 60 for this gorgeous, gorgeous game. Anyway, if you're into open world games, I highly recommend this one. If all you want from your Zelda games is a purely Zelda experience, this might not scratch that itch. I love this game, but it does not scratch that Zelda itch for me. The characters are Zelda, the artwork is Zelda, the gameplay is very Zelda, the music is very Zelda. In fact, a lot of the tracks are remixes of older, more iconic tunes, but the world, in my opinion, decidedly is not Zelda. And my goals don't feel very Zelda either, so it's not really scratching that Zelda itch. You may think that I'm just nitpicking or whatever, but hey, that's how I feel, those are my opinions. And if you made it this far, thanks for listening to them. This video ended up being a lot longer than I anticipated, but I hope you enjoyed it. And please let me know what you think about this video in the comment section below and what you think about the game. Please, no spoilers. I really hate that I have to say that out loud, but please, no spoilers in the comment section. Don't be that guy. Anyway, if you liked the video, you know what to do. There's a thumbs up button, there's a thumbs down button if you hated it. There's also a subscribe button if you want more of me. And then a Twitter you can follow at ingeniousclown if you want to get more ramblings from me. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.